Hello, happy National Canadian Film Day. Hi, Raj. Wonderful to be here with you and with the Friends of Canadian Media.
Happy to be here, Jack. Thanks for having us.
National Canadian Film Day, as some of you may or may not know, is 2,000 screenings across the country and in more than 40 countries around the world. A couple of million people are watching on their couches, online, or with a broadcaster. And there are screenings absolutely everywhere, and also online events such as this for people such as yourselves. What are your members going to be watching for National Canadian Film Day?
Well, the film is called In Bed with an Elephant, which of course is a reference to the famous Pierre Elliott Trudeau line. It was released in 1986, a year after the founding of Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, now Friends of Canadian Media, and we thought it would be the perfect film to exhibit today. It tells the story of decades of trade tension between American presidents and Canadian prime ministers.
Why would that be relevant today?
Well, I'll tell you. It tells the story of trade tensions, which are obviously top of mind today for Canada as it re-enters CUSMA negotiations. But what it's really discussing is the power asymmetry that Canada has to live with in dealing with the United States, which is a conversation which is constantly relevant.
This is always what we try to do at National Canadian Film Day. Every year, we try to get a sense of what is this moment? Why does it matter this year? Why does it matter right now? Last year, it was pretty clear. We were in the middle of a trade war. Everyone was in shock. Our elbows were up. This year, the shock has worn off a little bit. We're calling it beyond elbows up. What do we do now? What is it we have to, how do we take that imperative that we all felt and put it into action?
Yeah. Elbows Up has to be about more than just rhetoric. It has to be about tangible action in support of Canadian industries. Obviously, our trade negotiators will be looking at all industries. Our focus is on the Canadian cultural industry. So that means tangible support for public broadcasting, for journalism, for Canadian film, for organizations that support the creation and the viewing of Canadian films. And so our focus this year will be ensuring that cultural policies and specifically the cultural exemption stays in place.
So, in light of that, what is top of mind for Friends of Canadian Media? What are you guys doing?
So the last couple of years has been quite heavy from a legislative and regulatory standpoint, and that will continue into 2026. Top of mind for us are the CUSMA negotiations. The Trump administration has obviously taken some dramatic action with respect to tariffs that's affecting economies around the world, Canada included, and the renegotiations of the Canada, US, and Mexico trade agreement could have profound effects for both the Canadian economy as well as the American and Mexican economies. And our focus is really on the Canadian cultural community. As you know, the federal government passed the Online News Act in 2023 to support journalism in this country. It passed the Online Streaming Act in 2024 to preserve and promote the production of Canadian content, film, and television in this country. And we want to see those pieces of legislation preserved and strengthened going forward. So,
and there's a huge threat that the Americans want those off. They want them on the table to negotiate. We want them off the table.
That's exactly right. If there's one constant throughout the years of negotiation between Canada and the US amongst our leaders is that Canadian leaders have been steadfast in their support for culture being off the table in these trade negotiations, which is why we've had a cultural exemption in our trade agreements dating back to the early 80s. And we support that cultural exemption. We want it maintained, and that's what we'll be fighting for.
And so telling your members, this is the marching papers, is it communicate with your representatives? Is it, how do they make their voices heard in that regard? Or how does the organization make itself heard saying we want that cultural exemption in place?
So we're encouraging our supporters to reach out to their local MPs through a letter writing campaign, reach out to their ministers who are in their ridings as well. For ourselves, Friends is participating in the conversation for the CUSMA review in a number of different ways. We're part of several stakeholder groups, amongst them the CDCE, the Coalition for the Diversity of Cultural Expression. But we'll also reach out to the relevant ministers and their staff as well. And we'll try to reach out to anyone within the government who's willing to hear us about the importance of maintaining the cultural exemption.
Yeah, we have to stand up for this.
Yeah.
If we don't, it will go away.
Absolutely.
The forces aligned against it are very, very powerful, and we have always had to make ourselves heard in this regard. And obviously at Real Canada, we feel that. that's why we exist as much as it is why you exist.
Absolutely.
To kind of cultural sovereignty is the phrase that I like.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we're in the business of ensuring that the policies and the laws are in place to support the creation of Canadian content. You're in the business of ensuring that you can connect that content with audiences. And so we support everything that you do. And we hope that everyone watching this will support our work in supporting the cultural exemption and the trade agreements.
And then C11, which you mentioned specifically, this is the one that was sort of shifted off into oblivion in order for when the Prime Minister decided he needed to do that in order to keep the trade talks going? Or?
No, that was the digital services tax.
Digital service.
So a little bit of context. No, it's great. It's great that you brought it up because, I think there's a lot of confusion out there and it's it's a great opportunity to correct it. So I think one thing people need to recognize that not a lot of people know is that a number of these large large American tech companies have been operating in Canada without contributing anything back to the system. The Googles, the Metas, they've been operating in Canada for the better part of a decade, and in some cases, not paying any tax whatsoever. So they operate in Canada, they benefit from operating in Canada, they extract revenue from Canada, and they give nothing back to the system, not necessarily even in taxes. Obviously, that's not fair. Our Canadian businesses do their share. They pay their taxes. They contribute through employment. They contribute through
Canadian broadcasters. Right in competition.
Absolutely. Canadian broadcasters, Canadian producers, Canadian cable and satellite companies. They all make a contribution to a healthy and sustainable content creation industry. And all we're asking for through the Online Streaming Act and the Online News Act is that foreign streamers do the exact same thing. And so later on this year, the CRTC will be issuing public notices to ask the question that, what should the Netflixes, the Disney Pluses, the Amazon Primes of the world contribute to the creation of Canadian programming? Last year, they established baselines, 5% contributions of their annual revenues.
And that was the digital services tax?
No, that was...
See, I don't have it straight myself.
No, that's all good. So the digital services tax is a Canadian federal government initiative.
We're not losing you, I hope.
So stick with us.
Stay with us. It gets really good.
So the digital services tax was just about taxing the revenues of the streamers who operate in Canada.
That was deferred.
That was deferred.
Okay.
What we're talking about is a contribution regime administered by the CRTC, which is different from taxes, but requires the streamers to reinvest a portion of their annual income into the creation and support of Canadian content and Canadian talent.
Just like the broadcasters.
Just like the broadcasters, just like the cable systems, just like the producers.
And just like the streamers do in, say, Australia or other countries in Europe, right? We're not the only people doing this.
Absolutely. Canada is not an outlier in this conversation. The EU passed an audiovisual directive, which basically requires streamers to have, I believe, 30% content shelf space for content from each country in which they operate. Individual countries in the EU have gone a step further in using that directive to require revenue-based contributions. France, Italy, and several others. Australia has created a revenue-based contribution regime. So Canada is not an outlier. Our European allies, Australia, several others are doing the same thing.
This is where it's interesting because the fact that we are in bed with the elephant.
That's exactly right.
Bed.
That's exactly right.
And so I think there's a particular interest there to ensure that we knuckle under.
Yeah.
Like I think the Americans take an affront at the fact that right next door to them somehow we consider ourselves sovereign.
Yeah.
And they do not consider us sovereign. I mean, they really don't on some level.
I think Canada's always had to navigate this relationship, this balance between influence and independence. And that balance has always existed in terms of our relationship with the United States. It likely will always exist. But obviously, Canada is proudly sovereign. We will always continue to be proudly sovereign.
But we have to fight for that sovereignty.
We have to fight for that. We have to fight for our industries. We have to fight for our voices. We have to fight for our reflection in our media. And that's why Friends is here. And that's why Real Canada is here.
So tell me about the whole CRTC deliberation about Canadian content and the definition of Canadian content. This is critical.
Absolutely. And I'll try to keep it high level because I certainly don't want to lose people in the weeds. So as we started to adjust our system to reflect the fact that we have these foreign streamers operating within the Canadian borders, we had to update all of our rules with respect to the creation of Canadian Canton. Up until this point, the only players within the system have been Canadian, so there's never been any need to have any rule around Canadian copyright ownership and the like. Since we changed the rules to essentially bring the streamers into the system, the CRTC had to initiate several public hearings, essentially to reevaluate how it defines Canadian content, who's going to own it, and when they're going to own it, and under what circumstances.
Let me give an example of
Yeah.
one of the things that vexes me. So there's this great documentary about Mr. Dressup. Canadian as could be, the CBC frankly should have produced it, but they didn't.
Right.
Who produced it? Amazon
Right.
wrote the check. Producers Canadian, directors Canadian, writers Canadian, subject matter, it's Canadian through and through, but it's owned by Amazon.
Right.
What is that? Is that a production that gets the benefit of a generous public tax regime? Or is it a foreign production that should only get that much support and no more?
So that's a great point, and it's a great question. Under the old regime, that would not have qualified as Canadian.
Because it's owned by Amazon.
That's exactly right. Under the new regime, the Commission has created essentially a three-part framework for ownership. Either ownership that is 100% Canadian, majority Canadian owned, or up to 20% Canadian owned. And streamers can decide which particular avenue they want to take. And depending on the approach they take, they can either retain copyright control of the Canadian defined program, or it reverts back to the producer. Now, obviously, the producers have some concerns. As you all know, they filed an appeal.
I have some concerns.
I think everyone has concerns. And to be very clear, the Commission was adamant in its decision when it issued this revision to the Canadian content policy that it would expect good faith negotiations, that it would get involved if and when it was necessary, and it put a lot of guardrails in place to ensure that even when the
But let me speak to the guardrails.
Sure.
I want everyone to be clear about this. So I spoke with a CRTC commissioner about this. He said, well, if it's just minority Canadian, if it's just 20% Canadian, then then the producer and the writer and the director, there has to be a lot of A-level creative content that is Canadian. I have worked in this industry.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that the director being Canadian means nothing. The writer being Canadian means nothing. Not that I don't want Canadian directors and writers working, but if we don't own the IP,
Sure.
it doesn't matter because the producer can fire the Canadian director and get another Canadian director.
Okay.
And the point here is that anybody can make whatever kinds of productions they want. But if we're going to spend our tax dollars, if we're going to support this with substantial tax credits and government subsidy, I think it needs to be owned by a Canadian production company because that's the only way we're going to be able to protect the telling of Canadian stories. I guarantee you that the folks who don't live here really don't care about Canadian stories per se.
Right. Well, I mean, it's a fantastic point. Look, whoever owns the content can monetize it. And there's no greater incentive to supporting and creating content than being able to derive revenue from it. So the conversation is ongoing. You've raised some absolutely fantastic points.
Watch this one closely, folks.
Yes, absolutely. It'll be litigated in court. And the conversation with the CRTC is ongoing. We certainly encourage everyone to get involved in the conversation. Friends is happy to be there to support your perspective to the CRTC, but there are a lot of great stakeholder organizations out there who can help you as well. But please get involved. This is about the future of the Canadian voice on Canadian screens.
So around that question of raising a voice and contributing to the discussion. In this year of Beyond Elbows Up, National Canadian Film Day has set out to try to start a conversation. A conversation has been going on, but it's been very high level. It's been CRTC hearings and in the industry. We want to start a grassroots conversation about where people are at about Canadian culture. How do they feel? And we're saying, tell us how you really feel. I believe this survey has been sent out to the members of Friends of Canadian Media.ca, and we're getting it out. Librarians are getting it out. We're getting it out to all over the place. And the questions, I think, are different from surveys that other people have put out because we're trying to get at how people feel about Canada, how they feel about Canadian stories, how they relate to them, how important they are, just to get a baseline. I mean, we sit here, we know it matters to us. But I'm really curious to know how, and I always mention this mythical librarian Swift Current. I don't know why, but people on the ground in these communities. The thing about National Canadian Film Day is it takes place in hundreds of communities, in small towns, in large cities. There's going to be like 100 events in Toronto, but there's also going to be something in Climax, Saskatchewan, one of my favorite named towns. And that is where we want to hear from people about whether these issues are real to them and whether they count. I believe that they are, and I
Yeah.
believe it because people come back year after year
Yeah.
to celebrate National Canadian Film Day. But if we can actually gather all that stuff into some sort of document, feed it back to everyone, say, look, here's where we are, keep this conversation going. I think that's a really important step in nation building, I
Yeah.
will say, because I say we want to unite our nation through film.
Yeah.
Part one is watch a Canadian story, watch a Canadian film. But part two is talk about it.
Yeah.
Talk about it with each other. Talk about how you feel.
Yeah.
This is what we need to do, I think, to really strengthen our sense of allegiance, strengthen our sense of understanding of one another,
Yeah.
and our sense of affiliation belonging to the same thing. That is the support that our trade negotiators need
Yeah.
when they sit down at the table.
100% agree. I look forward to completing that survey. I encourage all of you to complete that survey as well.
Well, as we said, who knows who was interviewing who on this, but this is your crowd, so you can have a word. And closing thought from Raj.
I don't think there's ever been a time in this country where I've met more people prouder to be Canadian. I'm thankful we had this conversation today. I'm thankful for the work that Real Canada does. And I encourage everyone to enjoy this film in front of you, In Bed with an Elephant.
Happy National Canadian Film Day, and get back to us on that survey, friends.ca.
Take care.